Everyone? As my good friend Burt Reynolds used to say, we've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. It is. It's a classic. Okay, there's a few folks in the back. We're going to go ahead and get started here. And I've got one of our top reps worldwide, Mr. Steve Lewarne, is going to be taking us through some pretty succinct sales plays on what we just learned from Erica and Julian. And again, we want some interactivity here. This is where the rubber's going to meet the road for us in the field and on the phones, okay? All right, so Steve, take it away.
All right, can you guys all hear me okay? Yep. All right. I don't know about anybody else, but when Julian got up here, it was like watching a kung fu movie for a little while where your lips were moving different from the audio. It's not happening right now, is it? Yeah. I need your guys' okay. Well, okay. So as Shane mentioned, my name's Steve Lewarne. I'm an account manager responsible for about 10 named accounts, all of them Hurley's, most of them financial. What we're going to talk about today for the next 45 minutes or so, provided I stay on time, is the sales plays. So this is something that I get really excited about because ultimately this is how I'm going to hit my number, how I'm going to make money, right? This is how you all are going to make money. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm going to start kind of by stating the obvious, right? For the sales reps in the room, this is kind of an obvious formula. The reason that I started with this is twofold. One is that for the next 45 minutes, what we're going to focus on in here is the first two. So we're going to talk about discovery and opportunity qualification. Obviously, there's some implied opportunity identification in there as well. How do we even identify we have an opportunity? Mark's going to get into ROI a little bit later after lunch. And then technical validation is obviously what the essays help us do, right? So discovery and opportunity qualification. The second reason I'm mentioning it is I've been an account manager for about a year. Prior to that, for the previous decade or so, I was part of the solution architect team. So I've been working in some form or fashion release management deals at Serena for as long as Serena's had the release solutions. Typically, when we engage in a sales cycle and are not successful, it's because we didn't do one of these four things adequately, right? We sell to our existing customers. I think Shane mentioned that. You're going to hear me talk about that. It's really easy to get into the habit when we're talking to the same customers to kind of ignore some of these things sometimes because they're people we talk to all the time, right? You got to be really careful about that with the release stuff, and we'll talk about why. Julian started to hit on process versus artifacts, so I wanted to start there. And then based on you guys, we'll decide how far we drill into this whole topic, right? At the end of the day, and actually let me back up. So it's interesting. We talked a lot about DevOps this morning. So last year I had 4 T2 deals. 3 of them were release. Of the release deals, 1 was standalone SDA. The other 2 were a combination of release solutions. My 1 non-release deal was a Dimensions deal. That Dimensions deal was the only engagement I had where DevOps was a topic of conversation, ironically, right? In my 3 release deals, they talked about a lot of the things that Julian talked about, CI, CD, pipelines, things like that. The term DevOps, though, was never explicitly used, right? So just kind of to reinforce the fact that DevOps is more than release management. I'm guessing, and we'll see what happens with you guys and myself over the next year, I'm guessing that was kind of an anomaly, right? I expect to hear DevOps more frequently in the release space. But in terms of what it is, so software development lifecycle, right? The business asks for something, develops something, it gets tested, and then it gets released into production. Release management is a subset of that. So if we look at what we call a release path to production, that's really what we're talking about managing, right? And the release space is kind of challenging, interesting, fun, however you want to look at it. If we're going to go sell ITSM, for example, right? I can go have a conversation with somebody in the ITSM space, and they're going to use words like incident management, problem management, RFC, CMDB, configuration item, and with a pretty good degree of certainty, I know what they're talking about. Because there's books written on these terms, they're very well defined. I don't have to validate, what do you mean by problem management? In fact, that would actually hurt my credibility in that space, right? Because it's an accepted term. Release is completely different. People will use terms completely incorrectly in the release space, right? I can't tell you how many times I've had people like that Dimensions deal say, we need to do DevOps because my CIO says I need to do DevOps. They don't really do DevOps, right? You aspire to DevOps by doing a whole bunch of different things. So when people use terms in the release space, you really have to validate what they mean. So when I use terms, just kind of take it with a grain of salt that these are kind of our terms that we use and are kind of generally acceptable. Your customers are going to mix and match these things all over the place. So we refer to the green boxes as stages in the path to production. That's really what we're managing there. So let me ask you guys a question. What's the difference between the green box down on the bottom that says dev and the darker green box at the top that says develop? Are they different? Are they the same things? What's the difference? Anybody? One's an environment. That's absolutely the difference, right? The green boxes on the bottom are literal environments. Now, who owns those environments is going to vary, as we'll talk about some use cases and some examples. But these are environments where the application actually runs. So that top box is developers writing code, developers doing other development stuff like unit testing and so forth. The stuff down on the bottom here, the path to production, are environments where we actually put our application and can make it run, right? I included build and unit test up there for a couple different reasons. When we talk about process and artifacts, right, we've got this process across the top, and we're going to delve into what I mean by the process. And we've got the management of artifacts on the bottom. So Julian, I think, referred to it as kind of splitting the line, right? When we talk about build and unit test, we're really talking about source code, right? We build source code, we unit test the built source code, not the thing that we actually deploy. So the reason that's relevant to this conversation is, to my point about the ITSM space, when customers talk about managing their release process, most of the time they mean where the green starts, from dev on. There are going to be cases, so I think Shane and Greg both mentioned DTCC, one of my release deals last year, where it starts all the way prior to build. So their release management team actually builds the code, which introduces a little bit of complexity from our perspective, from a sales perspective, because the solutions that we position are different, right? So you may or may not have heard the debates around, is it SDA, is it dimensions from an artifact perspective? It's probably SDA from an artifact perspective, but dimensions may need to be in the mix there depending on how they define release, right? So we'll give you some examples. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is what your essays are for. So this is just more context, you to kind of keep in mind as you're talking to your prospects. It may need dimensions down there depending on what they're talking about. So when I talk about source versus artifacts, is everybody pretty clear on the difference? My next slide talks to that in detail. We can skip it if everybody's solid, or I can talk about it. Do we need to talk about it? Sure. So here's a really basic example, right? Let's take a WAR file. A WAR file is just a web archive. That's what that stands for, right? What's the difference between a WAR file and an EAR file? Anybody? Marketing is the difference, right? Oracle decided that they wanted to differentiate themselves, so they came out with the EAR terminology. Enterprise archive compared to WAR web archive. They're the same thing, right? It's a zip file. If you renamed a WAR file to .zip, you could open it up in WinZip, right, and look at it. It's just a compressed file. So let's assume that I'm a Java developer. I've got myObject.java. Let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that I'm going to do some math in there. So that thing's going to take two numbers and add those two numbers together. That's the code I'm writing, right? Most development teams nowadays do unit testing, so myObject.test.java is my unit test that I write for it. When people talk about unit testing, and this comes up quite a bit in the release space, the distinction between unit testing from functional testing or user acceptance testing is that unit testing is done by the developers. So they're writing code to do that. So when I write myObject.java, I also write myObjectTest.java. That's my test, okay? That gets built. That's the build process there in number 2. The result of that is class files. So I take my Java files, and by the way, Java is text. So you can open it up in a text editor, you can read it, it's readable, right? And it creates the class files for both of those. Class files are binary files. If you open it in a text editor, it's just going to be a bunch of gobbledygook, right? Once I generate those class files, I run my unit tests. And so in the Java world, JUnit is kind of the ubiquitous, very well-known unit testing framework. So it's going to take my object test.class and it's going to run it against my object class. So what it's going to do in this example is it's going to say, hey, I'm going to validate that if I pass 5 plus 5, I'm going to get back 10. And if I pass 50 plus 50, I'm going to get back 100. Right? It's going to validate that my functionality that I wrote in my object actually works. Assuming that that passes, then I package it up in number 5, and what I get out at the other end is myapp.war. Now bear in mind, typically you would have a whole bunch of Java files, right? It wouldn't be one file called myObject.java. It would be my file and Wes's file and everybody else's files getting put together in the application. That's the difference between source and artifact. Now bear in mind, I've got build up top, and I've got build as step 2. Literal build is to take Java and make it class files. right? Most people, when they talk about build, when they talk to you about build, they're talking about steps 2 through 5. And if any one of those steps fails, their build fails, right? So when they talk about their build process, it typically implies unit testing. So sources on the left, artifacts on the right. So just to reiterate, most of the time from a release management perspective, we're dealing with the artifacts. If you are talking to somebody like a DTCC, you're dealing with source, and then you have to deal with all the stuff in the middle. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Do they sometimes include a static testing stage? Is that right, Steve?
Yeah, you're talking like a code review kind of thing? Right.
They'd stick that in 4 or somewhere between 4 and 5.
Right. So what Greg's referring to is like, and I think we're going to see this a lot tomorrow, right? The expert chains and dimensions, for example, doing things like SonarQube or PMD or check styles, right? Does the myObject.java that I wrote conform to the enterprise standards, coding standards, and so forth, right? So there's static analysis that's done as part of that. We good? Was there a question? Okay. Are we clear on that? Source versus artifacts? So then we're going to get into process versus artifacts. Let me just build this out. Erica talked about this a little bit. I wanted to reinforce it, right? Both of our solutions, when we talk about release control or deployment automation, with a minor exception as to the why, they all answer the same questions, right? They all answer the what, why, when, how, where, and who. The difference is context, right? And this is really important to understand because when you're talking to their customer and they say things like, well, I don't have visibility into my process, they don't necessarily mean our definition of process, which is release control. They might mean from an artifact perspective. So let's quickly talk about what the differences are. So let's start with the what. So when I'm talking about what from a release control perspective, I'm talking about what am I actually delivering to the business. So if Shane asks Don, hey, what are you delivering in 14.1? He doesn't want to know that war file version 43 is being delivered. He wants to know the features that are being delivered, right? So enhancement number 21, that's what's being delivered in the release, right? So it's the higher level process what. Whereas from an artifacts perspective, it's literally what version of a file am I delivering out, right? So it's very tactical. Does that make sense from a what perspective? When we start talking about the why, release control will track why are we delivering enhancement number 21? Is it going to drive revenue for us? Is it to keep existing customers happy? What's the business reason we're doing it? Typically, it ties back to a project or some kind of request for change, right? So it's the business justification to even do the what as to the why. SDA really doesn't address the why unless somebody wants to argue that it does, and then I'm open to it, but I don't think it does. Fair statement, Julian? Yeah, okay. So the when, from a process perspective, is what release is being targeted, right? So again, using Shane as an example, when he asked Don, hey, when's my enhancement 21 coming, what he's looking for is it the June release or the October release? He's not looking for Tuesday at 3 o'clock, right? Which is what the artifact layer cares about, right? It doesn't look at things in the context of a release. It looks at, I'm deploying this version on Tuesday at 4 o'clock, and it might be dev, it might be production, right? It might be somewhere in between. Is that pretty clear on the when? The how are the steps involved. Now this is probably the trickiest one of all of the questions because it seems really similar, right? So let me give you an example. The how from a process perspective might be that I need final, and let's assume we're going to production. How do I deploy this thing to production, right? So from a process perspective, it might be step 1, get final approval in the ITSM tool, i.e. ServiceNow. That's step 1. Step 2 is to deploy the application. Step 3 is to run the validation that the application deployed successfully. So from a process perspective, that's my 3 high-level steps, right? That step 2, deploy the application, might entail 20 different things that are going on at the tactical level. Those are the things defined down at the bottom, those 20 different things. So deploy the application, step 2 at the top, may be to call an SDA execution down at the bottom. So it's more of strategic versus tactical. The business, what does the business people care about versus the technical people caring about, right? And then there's shades of gray in there, obviously, as well. Where is pretty much the same question, which environment am I going to? And there's some reasons why we have some redundancy there. There are situations where we sell RLC without selling SDA and vice versa, right? And so you need to know where things are going. And then from a who perspective, with release control, it answers a whole lot of questions. Who asked for it? Who's approving it in each environment? Might be multiple people. Who's involved in the release? Who's responsible for the release? Who's actually going to execute the release? Whereas down at the bottom, it's literally just the person that clicked the button, right? It's an audit trail more than anything. Does that make sense in terms of process and artifacts? So those are the questions that it's answering. So that as we go into kind of how do we do discovery for these things, these are kind of the high-level things we want to keep in mind. Questions or comments on that before we jump into discovery? All right. So discovery, right? How do we approach these things from a discovery perspective? This is not specific to the release. This is the exercise that I go through with all of my accounts, right? This is where we're kind of looking at the puzzle pieces in the box and trying to make a pretty picture, right? We like to say that we sell to our customer base, which is true. We sell to the same companies. That doesn't mean we sell to the same people. Most of the time, particularly with the release tools, we're going to sell to somebody else, right? So we're going to leverage our existing relationships to move laterally or up and down to sell to a new person, right, that owns the release. So as we were talking about, how we present this today, one of the things that came out of this was this discovery worksheet. This was something that we came up with, and I'll give you a bigger version in a second, that is intended to help you, particularly if you're newer, navigate your customers, right? There's two different versions of it, and we'll look at a version in a second. One is digital, meaning it's in a PowerPoint for you. You can just start typing. The other one is kind of blank, intended to be printed out and written on, right? So here's an example of the digital version. The areas that look like prompts are prompts, so you can click in there and the prompt goes away and you can start typing. The way in which I would use this, let's assume that we're talking to a PVCS customer. So this actually plays nicely with tomorrow's presentation as well, right? PVCS, as we all know, fits into that little green box down there, right? So we have a relationship within that green box. As we start talking to that individual, we want to know, it's a safe bet to assume that that individual knows stuff in the boxes around them. So if I'm talking to somebody in the source code box, they're probably going to know how requests are delivered from the business. They're probably going to know how development tracks development tasks. They're probably going to know how builds are done. It's not as certain that they're going to know stuff all the way over on the other end. So if you ask your PVCS guy how they do ITSM help desk, may not know, right? But we can begin to build these things out so that when I go and have a conversation, I'm building out the boxes around who I'm talking to, and then I'm going to get an intro to one of those people and build out the boxes around them. What that leads us to is something that looks like this, right? I realize it's an eye chart. We're not going to go through this all the way, but this is an example of a completely filled out discovery worksheet. You're going to see this again this afternoon because this is the basis for the ROI exercises that we're going to do, right? This is actually a real customer of ours as well. And you'll see down on the bottom, you've got a section for challenges and pain. This is an internal document, right? This isn't something you put in front of your customer and ask them to fill out. It's something intended for you guys just to kind of give you a mental map as to, if I'm talking to PVCS, who do I ask to talk to? Well, you ask to talk to, you ask to figure out how do they do request management, task management, builds, and so forth. Does that make sense? All right. Don't think there were any other points I wanted to make about that one. All right. So that as we're going through that discovery process, what are we looking for at a high level? And we're going to drill into these in a second. But what are we looking for at a high level that tells us we may have either an SDA opportunity or a release control opportunity, right? So these are kind of the high-level things. So from an SDA perspective, what we're looking for are how do they do deployments and configurations. And bear in mind that those two things may be considered the same from a customer. Lots of people consider those one and the same. I deploy and configure, that's one step. Whereas other accounts, it's two very different things done by very different teams. And that could also vary from environment to environment. So when you're deploying into that dev environment, it might be development that owns both of those. Whereas if you're deploying to production, it might be a release management team that owns the process or the deployments, but somebody else that actually owns the implementation into like WebSphere or whatnot. Manual and scripted, we just talked about configurations. So those two things, why am I looking for manual stuff with SDA? Anybody? What's that? Because we automate it, right? That's the main thing, right? With SDA, and so I mentioned I have 10 accounts. 5 of those are SDA customers. I think we've got 2, April and I have 2 opportunities with 2 of those others. And frankly, I'm not going to claim success until all 10 of them have SDA, right? SDA is one of these things that we should be able to sell that to every single account that we have. Release control, a little bit squishier, but SDA, unless they already have a competing tool, like unless they've already rolled out Udeploy across the organization, there's an opportunity there for us, right? So what we're looking for is the manual stuff they do today. We're listening for the buzzwords, continuous delivery, deployment pipelines, right? That's what SDA does, is to allow you to define a deployment pipeline. Deployment toolchain integration. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about toolchain integration. in both cases, in both SDA and release control, toolchain integration is one of the primary drivers that I've used to drive revenue, right? Because it's one of the areas of the biggest source of pain around both manual interaction as well as auditing, right? And we'll drill into that a little bit. The difference between them, you'll see them on both cases, is the set of tools, right? So when we're talking about SDA, we're talking about the tactical stuff, the stuff they use in the course of deploying and configuring software. So it's load balancers, it's database tools, it's application servers and things like that. Release control is a slightly different set of things, right? So release control, we're looking for, do they have a release process? Believe it or not, there's a lot of customers that don't have a release process, right? Their development interacts directly with ops. There's nobody sitting in the middle. Even at some of my accounts, which is mind-boggling how they get away with that, right? But it happens. So do they have a release process? Erica mentioned it. How do they do approvals, right? Because again, what I'm trying to figure out is, do they do things in a manual and difficult to audit fashion, like email? I'm looking for things that I can use to drive a compelling ROI, is really what it boils down to. Visibility, insight, and audit, right? Those are a little bit squishier value props. Everybody can agree when you talk to a customer that visibility, insight, and audit, meaning the ability to easily pass an audit, are valuable. It's really tough to get somebody to quantify a dollar value on those things, right? So we definitely want to look for them, we want to talk about them, but just bear in mind from an ROI perspective, it's a little trickier, right? And then again, the toolchain integration, the only difference here is these are process tools. So I'm looking, and Erica showed us some of these in the demo, right? What content from a process perspective, meaning defects, enhancements, and so forth, am I pulling in? How am I doing my approvals if ServiceNow or Remedy? So in my accounts, right, all very large, they all have standard ITSM tools. Typically, I think without exception, it's either BMC or Remedy, right? We have to integrate into those. I don't have a single release control customer that does not integrate to ServiceNow or Remedy, to put it in perspective. And then lastly, and this is a big one, and we've heard it from a couple different people, the cross-platform release management, right? So UBS, the original deal, I did a smaller deal with UBS this year that was just an endpoint expansion for SDA. The original deal a couple of years ago was about $136,000. $100,000 of that was a mainframe connector, right? So if that had not been in play, it wouldn't have been worth our time to go pursue that at a $30,000 deal. In hindsight, it would have been because that drove more revenue, but I think you guys get my point, right? Questions about any of this? Yeah. That's an excellent question, and based on what you just told me, I would need to dig deeper, right? It's potentially an opportunity. I mean, what I didn't hear in what you just said is, do they have any pains around it? Does it work well for them? Yeah, so this is my personal opinion on this, right? And bear in mind, it's from the perspective of a guy that only has 10 accounts. So if I disqualify everybody, I have nowhere to go, right? So I really have to think about it before I disqualify somebody. But in that particular case, I would try to go find somebody else to talk to. I mean, somebody with that small of a footprint that's not expressing any kind of pains, I probably would go look. There's opportunity cost for me to chase that, right?
Is there a scenario there where, because of their maturity or lack thereof in that process,
they don't realize that they have pain? Or, in other words, could we create that?
Yeah, so my experience with that, Wes and I just had a conversation with a group at UBS about this, where the epiphanies that these people had in the room was pretty amazing, but that doesn't drive revenue always, right? So there's an evangelical part to that, which I think that, you know, from our perspective, we invest quite a good amount of time into those. Again, I'm a little different because I only have 10 accounts, so if I have the ability to do some evangelizing and build some mind share so that next year I can harvest that, it's worth my time. If I had a territory with, you know, umpteen accounts to go out and hunt in, I don't know how much, I don't know, it's always a trade-off, right? There's always an opportunity cost to doing that kind of thing.
very small 10 accounts, right?
Yeah. You get my point, though, right? Like, you know, UBS, when they tell me that they're going to, what was it? It was get TeamCity and Nexus, which is really funny because last year it was Subversion, Jenkins, and Artifactory, right? So they've completely changed their stuff. And we got into a conversation about how do you do traceability and source to load and in the room. And they had already decided to do all this stuff. In the room, they realized that they weren't going to get that out of it, right? So yeah, you can do the little I won the conversation dance, but that doesn't generate revenue for us, right? Does that answer your question, Erica?
Related companies is that when you have something that basic, you can't justify the ROI of buying an SDA in order to automate that process.
Right.
I mean, the script is pretty darn basic.
Right.
And it, you know.
Yeah, I think just kind of generalizing without knowing anymore, I think what I would do in that case is we do have the community edition with SDA. It has 5 endpoints. I'll caveat this. I would be a little careful doing that because that can backfire on you, right? You can start an endless science fair project, in other words, by giving them, by encouraging them to go to the community edition. But for something like that, I would probably encourage that. We've actually got one of our accounts that we're doing I think we're on our 4th month of a science fair project, and it may result in them using SDA, it may not. The benefit is what I've seen from all of my accounts is once you can get SDA in there, it will grow. It's just a question of when. So sometimes there's that trade-off. If I can get somebody to agree to use it and start to realize some amount of value, then eventually it will grow. It may not be, it may not help me make my number this year, but it's going to tee me up for later. Right? Question?
Yeah, and then the other part to that is obviously the conversation that you can have with the customer around compliance and audit. Because if they're just running scripts at the moment, how do they prove, how do they validate, how do you justify that something actually took place? It's down to an individual saying that it took place, whereas with automation, you've got that history, you've got that audit, you can go to the audit officer or the compliance person when they come in and say, this is the report that shows exactly how this data got into production.
How do they maintain too? Usually not just one script, many. Give the mic, please. Well, there's also but, how do you maintain those scripts? Usually it's not one, especially in a large enterprise, it's many. Who does that maintenance? Do they want to be in the business of maintaining that software?
Right. I'm going to get into executing the plays, and I talk about some of that stuff. So let's jump into it. And if we need to talk about it, bring it back up again. We can talk about it. So when we look at executing the plays, I struggled with this a little bit, right? When we were preparing for this, one of the things that Shane really wanted was, as prescriptively as possible, how do we go tackle these things, right? And my first reaction was totally impossible. You can't be prescriptive with this stuff. And then this is what I came up with. So with that caveat, right, SDA, I think we can get pretty prescriptive. So the way I look at it is it's the difference between a Google map and a treasure map, right? So SDA, and we'll talk about this in a second, I can give you steps to go run an SDA play that barring, using the Google map analogy, barring construction along the way, i.e. a competitor coming in, or in my case, I don't think I had a single deal last year that wasn't impacted by a reorg, right, all those kinds of things. Barring those, you'll end up in a position from a sales rep to be able to close the deal. Whether or not you close it, there's other factors, right? But you'll be in a position to be able to close a deal. Whereas with release control, I can get you to step 1, and then you got to figure out some clues. And that will get you to step 2, and then you got to figure out some clues. So we'll talk about those clues, right? So that's the difference. So starting with SDA, and if I didn't say it at the beginning, I should have. Thanks. I'm obviously generalizing a little bit here, right? There's shades of gray in here. It's not always going to be as straightforward as I'm making it sound. So with SDA, generally, what we want to do is the first thing we want to do is identify who owns one of these stages on the path to production, with the understanding that in a lot of cases, in most of the organizations that we deal with, not just me, but we deal with, you typically can boil it down to 3 different groups owning the path to production. There's a development group that's going to own some stages. There is some kind of a quality, release management, shared services group that's going to own some middle stages, and operations going to own production. There's always some variations on that, but generally that's how it plays, right? So what you're looking for is to go talk to one of those groups who owns environments and then find out how they do deployments and configurations today. So bear in mind, this is a standalone SDA play. We're going to talk about standalone RLC plays in a second. Obviously, you can combine the two, but this is a standalone SDA play.
From beginning to end, what is our benchmark and the amount of time it takes to close the SDA?
That's a great question. Do you know? So the question was kind of generally, what's the sales cycle duration, right, of an SDA sale? Do you know? I mean, do we know? globally?
Once you're into the actual conversations, technical conversation with the customer, it's between 3 and 4 months. It can be shorter than that, but we've seen sort of an average of 3 to 4 months with an ASP of about 110, I think, something like that. For release control, way longer. You're looking at between 8 to 12 months.
Yeah.
Well, there are exceptions to that too. The example that Erica was showing up there, which looked crazy given how manual it was, is actually one of the largest insurance companies in the world that are guaranteed.
Probably at least a third of the people in this room use. We won't name the names. It's insane that these global massive companies lack the kind of process that we end up implementing. But that particular sales cycle ultimately was 2.5 months. And we're expanding now because it is a very large company into other groups. But so release control is a tougher cycle. It's a more complex sales cycle. But it can also be quick depending on the situation.
And bear in mind too, these are initial deals.
Right, that's my question.
Right, yeah, add-on deals can go much quicker, right, as we'll talk about when we get into the success stories. So step 3, I'm looking for manual steps. Right now, jumping ahead, and I'll come back to it, there is an ROI exercise down at the bottom, towards the bottom, right? During that ROI exercise, you're going to identify pretty detailed all the manual steps and everything. So step 3 is kind of almost like an initial higher level, what are the manual steps? And what I'm looking for there is how many people do manual steps, how long do those manual steps take, and how frequently do they do them? And so if you put that together with step 4, how many servers, from an account manager perspective, what am I doing with step 3 and 4? Even before that, I'm qualifying. I'm deciding if I want to waste time on this, right? If it's Wes and I had a engagement with AIG where there were 8 people in a room who all worked together and didn't express any kind of pain. And so without even having to go through the RO exercise, I had to have a conversation with my sponsor. We need to find another team to pilot this thing because there's no way I'm going to be able to show a return for, right? I mean, it's just being able to do that high-level math of what's kind of at a very high level, what's the ROI I think I'm going to be able to put together versus what am I going to be able to get from this customer? That's where the servers come in, right? If it's 5 servers, right, that's a really small deal. If it's 500 servers, that's different. So is there a desire to improve? You're going to find pain points all over the place, right? I mean, if I got paid for finding pain points, I would have been at 1,000% of my quota last year, right? Number 5 is probably the hardest from my experience, is finding somebody that actually has a desire to improve. And let's quantify what we mean by that. I mean somebody who's willing to take my ROI and my proposal and sponsor it to get a deal done, not just somebody that says, yeah, I wish this was better, right? I need somebody that's actually going to help me run it up through management. Number 6 is where this is the only time that you're going to see a question mark after services, right, is with SDA. So there's a question mark there for a reason. This is where we need to decide if we're going to position services. The reason that we do that here prior to step 7 is services is part of the investment. And I can't calculate an ROI without understanding the investment. Brian has created some quick starts, right? They're up on the sales portal. For SDA, it's a week. The reason there's a question mark there is if you're in a competitive sales cycle, most other vendors in this space don't require services. They recommend it, but they don't require it. We don't require services, right? We have a community edition. It is possible. I have a couple customers who've done it to get SDA stood up on their own. I also have customers that I'm amazed they make it home at night and back to work, right? And so I wouldn't do that without services. So this is just, you're sitting down and kind of gauging the situation. Does the competitive landscape allow me to do this? Is the customer capable of being successful on their own, et cetera, et cetera? I typically lean on yes services unless there's a reason not to do it, right? I think that's a pretty good foundation. Number 7 is perform ROI. Mark's going to get into that. And then number 8 is the technical validation, right? So this is where we take all of the information that we've done. I think Erica alluded to this, along with the stuff we figured out during ROI, and we go through the final technical validation. This is the technical closure, right? We always want to err on whatever is the quickest and easiest that we can get away with. So we start with a demo, POC, pilot. If a customer says, can you guys do a POC? We say, absolutely. Our way of doing a POC is to come in and have somebody demo to you for 2 hours. That works part of the time, right? So we always want to make that as short as possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the first time they're seeing the product, right? So we may have done a demo or two to our sponsor to get that sponsor, But this is where we're actually technically closing so that we don't have an endless series of demos or the endless series of pilot, right? And then lastly, close the deal. Yeah, Greg, sorry.
I didn't want to stop the closing the deal part. That was good. That was a good part. In SDA, the SDA deals I've seen are almost always competitive. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4 competitors popping up. Can you talk about, as you're going through this sales play, how are you setting up, you know, tilting the balance to our favor? Where and how are you laying the traps? What are you doing so that by the time we get to 8, it's maybe just us and one other player doing a POC? Or just us?
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
I may defer to Julian for the simple reason that, and even going back to when I was in SA, I actually did not get involved in very many competitive SDA deals. Most of my SDA deals that I've worked were do nothing. That was the competition, right? And so it really was a matter of building the ROI. But from a competitive perspective, you want to talk to that real quick?
Yeah, I think the big ones are still as they were sort of 12 months ago. The big ones are all around pipeline management. So everyone's got an automation capability, and then it becomes a question of, do you prefer the blue one or the green one? The additional value adds that we have from the automation perspective is our inbuilt pipelines, which Wes will show this afternoon. It's the capabilities that gives us the visibility into environments that our competitors can't do. Again, if it's just a simple SDA play, we get into the realms of trying to compete one against one. So comparing SDA to IBM Urban Code, for example, or Zebia, if it really is just a one-on-one with those guys, we're technically and functionally stronger. So we want to be showing and focusing on pipelining, we want to be focusing on security, we want to focus on scalability and architecture. Those will give us a big advantage. Of course, then IBM and CA and Zebia will try and roll in other technologies, so they'll try and roll in either their source control systems if they're IBM, or they'll try and pull in their release process capabilities. Of course, if they expand the deal to that, it should be a no-brainer, because our release control process capabilities and functionality is way superior to those guys. So pipelining, visibility, inventory management, and the scalability is where I would go from a POC perspective.
What about mainframe?
Of course, if mainframe comes up as a topic of conversation, then we can start talking about deploying onto mainframe from the SDA perspective.
But isn't that a differentiator that we can actually do both?
In this case, when we're talking about automation, purely the automation play, we probably wouldn't get into the mainframe conversation. We could do, but that becomes more of the process of release control across the top, triggering ERO or ZMF plus the distributed and the automation pieces. That would be my way of focusing in it anyway.
Yeah. The last point I'll make, and something Julian said just triggered this, and I haven't heard it this year, but just for the folks that have been around a while, we used to say, you know, our sweet spot for SDA was like application servers, right? So web, Java, .NET, so forth, and to kind of steer clear of I don't know if steer clear is maybe not the right word, but you know, beware databases as an example, database automation. If I look at my accounts where we've sold SDA, database is probably 90% of them, right? So if we look at DTCC and what they've automated, it's Informatica, it's Greenplum, it's DataStage, it's things that are not typically things that we'd consider in our core sweet spot, and yes, yet they get a whole lot of value out of doing those things.
In that example, the type of companies
Where that's true, is there any comments you could share with the rest of the reps? Is it companies that process a large amount of transactions would be potentially viable candidates for that, whether they're financial transactions or credit card processing or something along those lines? Is there a qualifier that says, hey?
I don't think so. If I understand your question right, I don't think so. I mean, at the end of the day, just general distributed development over the last 10 years is multi-tiered, and all that means is that I have a web front end and I have a database, right? And the automation space is still relatively new, but the application servers, like WebSphere, WebLogic, Tomcat, JBoss, not only is that everybody's sweet spot, right? And a lot of those vendors, the people who make WebSphere is IBM, right? So obviously Udeploy works well with it. But people have, I wouldn't say they've solved that problem, but it's not as much of a problem. Whereas database and automating the database deployments is still the big mystery and the big pain point. And that's probably going to apply across the board, right? If they're developing distributed software, they're going to have database deployment challenges. Any other questions about this before we jump into the RLC?
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
Quick technical question. Containers is pretty new. How does that impact the server counts and SDA endpoints? Is there any real impact there?
It's a great question. So the question was containers. So Steve knows they're new, but how does the introduction of containers impact our licensing?
Just after lunch.
Same question applies, by the way, in the cloud environment where I'm dynamically provisioning and tearing down environments, right? Tuesday I might have 100 servers, Wednesday I might have 10, right? So how does that impact my licensing? So we'll talk about it after lunch.
I have one more comment real quick.
Yeah.
Testing. Your point about desire to improve, number 5. That's what Command of the Message was all about, and that's what spin selling is all about, is to help create a sense of urgency to take action. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, excellent, thanks. Any other questions about SDA before we jump into release control? So this is the fun one, right? Because this is the treasure map. And so what I'm going to do, the approach that I'm going to take here is I'm going to lay out the high-level steps just like we did with SDA. The difference is that I realize that a lot of these are easier said than done. And so we're going to drill into the easier said than done ones after we kind of lay them out, right? So at a high level, yeah, oh, just time, gotcha, thank you. At a high level, the very first thing we want to do is identify our sponsor, right? More than anything that we sell, release control becomes a political play in the organization. Release control has the ability to touch so many areas of the organization that what you'll find is the dev guy doesn't like the QA guy who doesn't like the ops guy because they all want each other's jobs and they all believe that they should own everything, right? So this more than anything is where you get into a lot of internal politics, and identifying the sponsor is not trivial. We'll drill into it in a second. Identifying the primary value drivers, right? And there's really 2 facets to this. I need to identify what's going to drive the deal, and I need to identify what's going to justify the deal. And they may not be, it's obviously going to be a subset, but it may not be the key things. We'll drill into that one as well. Identify the number of users impacted by the release process. Why do I care? License fee, right? This is a tricky thing for us. Even in big organizations, right? DTCC is an example, and Greg mentioned, they $1.6 quadrillion of transactions. They had 15 people in their release team. 15 people, right? It's not typical for organizations, even big organizations, to have hundreds of people in their release teams. So one of the things is that we need to understand that when we sell release control, we're looking for more than just the release team, and I'll get into that as well. It's really a high-level qualification point, though, right? Are we integrating with ZMF? So not only is that going to drive a lot of the value, there's also part of that qualifying the deal, right? Because that's a cost, that's a significant cost for us, right? Are we integrating or identifying the manual steps and integration points? Right, we'll talk about that one. And then the rest of them are pretty much the same as SDA, right? Just normal kind of sales process stuff, right? So let's actually drill into these and talk about each one. So when we talk about identifying a sponsor, this is going to be one of the hardest parts of kind of starting a release control deal, is finding somebody that's willing to kind of champion this within the organization. So I always start with the obvious, right? We're looking for a release management team because those are the people that when you ask them, how do you manage your release process, will have an answer for you, right? The potentially tricky thing is that you're looking for a release management team that spans multiple development teams as opposed to a release management team within a development team, right? Ash and I worked a couple of years ago, I'm sure a couple of the other SAs worked this LexisNexis, where we worked with the guy, the Gaunt's laughing, we worked with the guy who was the worldwide release manager reporting to the worldwide app dev manager. This guy had every single release management problem known to man caused by the fact that his boss allowed the development teams to do whatever they want. So we ultimately, even though it looked and smelled like a great opportunity for us, it was a horrible opportunity for us. We spent a whole lot of cycles on that. You also want to avoid or at least beware of enterprise release management from an ITSM perspective, right? So similarly, when I was an SA, I went in with a sales rep to talk to a guy at UBS whose title was Worldwide Release Manager, right? He was the head of Worldwide Release Management. When we sat down with that individual, he said, ServiceNow solves all of my problems, right? I have no problems that ServiceNow can't address, because he was looking at things from, do I know what goes into production and have approvals been given? He wasn't looking at anything prior to that, right? It was just that production. So if you can't find a release management group, your next step down is to look in the quality team. An example there is when we did the original DTCC deal a couple years ago, that was done with the head of quality. So in a lot of times, if they don't have a formal release management team, it is a function of quality. I think it's a safe bet to say pretty much every organization has a quality team, right? So that's somewhere that you can go talk to. And then lastly, if you don't get anywhere with the quality team, identify who owns the execution of the change management process. So I made that comment about going and meeting with the worldwide release manager at UBS and getting nowhere. We left that gentleman's office. We went and met with Ron Rougeau, who is the head of change management for WMA. He had all the problems, and he owned all the problems, and that's what drove the deal, right? So that's kind of the sequence that I go through when I'm looking for the potential sponsor within either a new company, I don't really have new companies, or new groups, right? New lines of businesses. That's the steps. Questions on that? No? Everybody's good on that? Identifying sponsor? What it boils down to is your sponsor has responsibility for the stuff. And I realize that's kind of a nebulous term, right? The stuff is going to differ from account to account, right, in terms of what they do. Visibility, governance, auditing, approvals, and so forth. And you can find that person just by asking who owns the release process. It's a pretty simple question, right? Most people are going to understand what you mean by a release process. You just have to be savvy enough to realize that if they direct you to James Lee, the head of worldwide release management at UBS, it's not the right guy, right? Because he's looking at it from an ITSM perspective. So that's the sponsor. Questions, comments? All right. So moving on to the value drivers. And I've got direct in there in parentheses. Distinguishing from indirect, visibility is an indirect value driver, right? You can get heads nodding when you talk about providing visibility and the value that it adds. It's really hard to get anybody to agree on a quantitative number on what that visibility is worth, right? So that's an example of an indirect value driver. What we're looking for here are the things that I can hone in on during my ROI exercise to justify the deal, right? So we're looking for things like how many tools are involved in the release process tool chain. Why do I care how many tools are involved in the release process tool chain?
The more there are, probably the more complex that process is.
Right. And cost, right? I think that right there is probably the key driver of all the release control deals I've done. Not because they just have a bunch of tools, but because the integration and reconciliation between those tools is typically manual, right? It's a lot of manual data duplication going back and forth. And so being able to come in and propose a solution that integrates and automates that interaction, it's something that you can then go and execute your ROI exercise and find out how many people are involved in that reconciliation, how frequently they do it, how much does that person cost, we can make some best guess, and at that point it becomes a math problem, right, to put some compelling ROI in front of them. We break this down, and Erica went through this in her demo, we break this down into 3 categories of things. It's probably a little irrelevant for the sales reps in the room. You're looking for tool chain integration, right? You're looking for the things they interact with as part of their deployment process or release process. Approvals. Approvals are the same thing, and Erica hit on it, right? In a lot of cases, approvals are done via email. In some cases, they're done by me going and getting Shane to approve, and then me saying in an email that Shane approved. Yeah, which is worse, right? I mean, we see releases done that way. And so when you look at, how much time is spent. This is a little squishier to kind of hone in on ROI. This is where you start to look at what's the lead time, right? When I ask Shane for his approval, do I get it that day? Does it take me a week, right? Those kinds of things. Do I have to wait for a CRB or CAB meeting where everybody gets in a room for an hour and waste time approving stuff? Because if I can remove that meeting, then I can start tallying up the number of people in that meeting. That's ROI. That's money I can give back to the customer. How is process governance addressed today? This is one that we hear a lot about, right? Process governance is what's the status, have certain things been done, so on and so forth. The reason that we're talking about it in the context of value drivers is if I ask somebody, how do you know what your release status is? A lot of people use colors, right? Red, amber, green. How do you know if something's red, green, or amber, right? Is it because of the fact that a Sev1 defect got opened up in HPLM and it's related to this release and therefore it's now amber? Or is it because Shane, the PM, went in and literally changed it to amber, right? And so there's both a direct and an indirect value driver from there. The direct is that I can remove the need for that person to go and update that status every day. The indirect value driver, which again is hard to quantify, is the fact that now you get real status. Because how many PMs are going to go mark themselves as red? It very rarely happens, right? And then how is mainframe release coordination done? Again, and what we're looking for there, that's kind of a subset of the tool chain, right? But it's worth calling out separately. It's people doing manual things to sync data between the two. So really, if you boil this down, we're looking for the process-related things, tool integrations, approvals, reporting, and status updates that are done manually. And in most organizations, you're going to have a plethora of these things to hone in on as soon as you get people talking, right? Questions about any of that? All right, identify the number of users potentially impacted by the process. And again, as we talked about, we're really looking for how many I can sell. Developers, QA leads, operations people, lines of business, right? We're looking for everybody that we can encompass into there. And I know some of you are probably thinking, well, gee, you know, there's a license cost associated with that. The customer's not going to want to pay that cost. That's kind of premature, right? We're looking for how many people we can get into the process, because when we put an ROI up, the cost of the solution becomes secondary to the value we can provide, right? And so if you just throw a big number out there with no benefit, yeah, sure, it's going to seem expensive. But in relation to the benefit we're going to give them, it's something that you can position and sell. Are we integrating with ZMF? Again, I can charge for that. That's the main reason that's up there right now, right? Because that's an additional cost. Identifying the manual steps and integrations point, we talked to that. The rest of these are the same, so I won't kill the time just because of the time going through those. Exactly the same as SDA. Identify that sponsors want to sponsor us, right? Validate via demo POC. Erica hit this, but it's worth emphasizing. Our customers, at least mine, lack imagination completely, right? And so, for example, Wes and I did a presentation for CVS a couple months ago, right? And it was a quick build and HPSM, I think, HP Service Manager. We showed that, at least we showed something that looked like that with HP Service Manager perspective, because these guys wouldn't have gotten it, right, if we had showed them something generically. So just kind of be careful. There's a difference between showing kind of a vision demo to your sponsor in kind of a safe environment versus talking to a room full of people where there's people that are attending that you've never met before, which happens quite a bit with these technical validation demos. And when you do that, you want to do that in the context of, hey, Julian, I understand you're responsible for this. Let me show you how it works. Rather than, I know you're responsible for Quick Build. Let me show you Jenkins, and you can use your imagination as to how it works with Quick Build. Right? Because that just doesn't seem to work that well. They're not able to make that leap. Right? Oh, and that slide actually is wrong. ROI should happen before the technical validation. I thought I fixed that, so my apologies.
Close the deals in the right spot.
Close the deals in the right spot.
You could do it earlier, that's okay.
All right, so next I'm going to pause for questions, and then Dagant and I are going to get into customer examples. Any questions about the release control process? We did that really fast, and it's not a really trivial thing to do.